Welcome back to the Thanks for Sharing podcast. Today, I'm going to be diving into something that has sparked a lot of conversation and even some controversy in mental health fields. And that is the diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, as defined in the DSM-5, which is currently the American Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. I'm also going to cover what complex PTSD or CPTSD is and why it is not included in the DSM's definition of PTSD. So first, let's get into some of the history and evolution of PTSD in the DSM. Starting with a bit of history, PTSD was first introduced in the DSM-3 in 1980. This was groundbreaking at the time because this was the first time the DSM recognized that the effects of trauma could persist long after the traumatic event had ended. And the definition focused heavily on the experiences of veterans and those exposed to trauma with a capital T. So it was significant, life-threatening events like being in combat, or natural disasters, or severe physical harm. Anytime a diagnosis makes its way into the DSM, and I will say it is a political process for a diagnosis to get recognized as a diagnosis in the DSM. But anytime a diagnosis gets into the DSM, it can open up research grants to further study the diagnosis. There has to be some research done before it's going to get into the DSM, but it also opens up some research to further develop what we know about the particular diagnosis. Since 1980, when PTSD was first introduced in the DSM, we've learned a lot more about how trauma affects people, and the criteria for PTSD has evolved with each edition of the DSM. In the DSM-5, which came out in 2013 and is the edition that we use now, I think there's actually a DSM-R, which means it's been revised. PTSD was moved from the anxiety disorder section to a new category. Historically, PTSD was under the classification of anxiety disorders. And the DSM-5 moved it from anxiety disorders to trauma and stressor-related disorders. This shift was more than just a reclassification. It was an acknowledgement of the complexity of trauma reactions and how they differ from traditional anxiety responses. So why was PTSD narrowly defined in the DSM-5? It has historically been narrowly defined, and in the DSM-5, that is also the case. The DSM-5's approach to PTSD keeps a specific focus on life-threatening or severely threatening events. This means that not all experiences that could be deeply distressing, like job loss or relationship issues, qualify as triggers for PTSD. The intention here is to avoid over-pathologizing distress and to focus on severe, often life-altering traumatic events that typically produce measurable and intense responses. There's an argument that keeping the definition narrow helps clinicians accurately identify cases where the symptoms align closely with those typical of PTSD. There's an argument that keeping the definition narrow helps clinicians accurately identify cases where the symptoms align closely with those typical of PTSD. It also allows researchers to develop treatments focused on specific neurological and psychological mechanisms that are disrupted by severe trauma. This narrow scope, however, does mean that not all trauma responses or symptoms are included in the definition or the diagnostic criteria. One of the most debated points about PTSD in the DSM-5 is its exclusion of complex PTSD, or what we refer to as CPTSD. CPTSD typically arises from prolonged or repeated trauma, often occurring in childhood or in situations where escape is not possible. So if we think of long-term abuse or captivity or ongoing trauma within the family system, unlike PTSD, which tends to focus on re-experiencing a specific traumatic event, CPTSD encompasses additional symptoms like disturbances in the development of self-identity, difficulties in regulating emotions, and problems in relationships. So why doesn't the DSM-5 include CPTSD as a diagnosis? One reason is diagnostic clarity. By keeping PTSD narrowly defined, the DSM-5 aims to avoid overlapping too heavily with other disorders. For CPTSD, some symptoms resemble those found in conditions like borderline personality disorder or major depressive disorder, which can complicate diagnostic criteria. The DSM-5's choice to keep CPTSD out also reflects a clinical debate happening in the field. Some argue that while CPTSD is indeed a distinct form of trauma response, it's better addressed under existing diagnoses like PTSD with additional comorbidities, such as a personality or mood disorder. However, this perspective isn't universal, and it's why the World Health Organization's International Classification of Diseases, or the ICD-11, has included CPTSD as a standalone diagnosis. Now, I would agree with that CPTSD should be a standalone diagnosis rather than including it in personality or mood disorders. Something that often surprises people, but wouldn't surprise you if you've been listening to this podcast for a while because I have mentioned this before. But for a lot of people, they are surprised to learn that the DSM-5, which I've been discussing, is only used officially in the United States. And I think part of the reason for that is the United States has a different form of health insurance. In most other countries, mental health professionals and healthcare systems rely on the International Classification of Diseases, or the ICD, which is published by the World Health Organization. Currently, most of the world is using the latest edition, which is the ICD-11, which has its own criteria and diagnostic categories for trauma-related disorders. Interestingly, although the DSM-5 and the ICD-11 are different systems, the United States actually uses the ICD-10 codes and soon to be the ICD-11 codes for billing and insurance purposes. This means that while the United States leans on the DSM-5 criteria to diagnose and treat conditions like PTSD, the actual codes used in medical records and insurance claims come from the ICD. This dual reliance can lead to some confusion, especially since the ICD-11 includes complex PTSD as a separate diagnosis. It also includes sex addiction, calling it compulsive sexual behavior disorder, unlike the DSM-5, which these two diagnoses are not included in. How would this impact someone seeking a diagnosis or treatment? Well, in countries where the ICD-11 is used, individuals can receive an official CPTSD diagnosis. This can allow for more tailored treatment options and a diagnostic label that specifically recognizes the effects of chronic trauma. In the US, however, a person with symptoms of CPTSD would likely receive a diagnosis of PTSD along with other related conditions, such as depression or personality disorders, like I talked about, to account for these additional symptoms. They might receive a diagnosis of generalized anxiety or some depressive diagnosis. The difference here underscores the unique ways that trauma and complex trauma are understood and addressed in the global context of mental health. The separation between DSM-5 and ICD-11 also reflects a broader debate in the mental health field about how to categorize and treat trauma-related disorders. Some clinicians and researchers argue that the ICD's approach to include CPTSD acknowledges the nuanced impacts of prolonged trauma, while others believe the DSM's more focused definition helps with research consistency. Either way, understanding these distinctions can be empowering for those navigating trauma treatment, particularly for people who feel their symptoms align more closely with CPTSD than with classic PTSD. So what is complex PTSD and how does it differ from PTSD? Complex PTSD goes beyond the typical PTSD symptoms of re-experiencing trauma or avoidance and hyperarousal. CPTSD includes symptoms related to persistent issues in emotional regulation, self-perception, and interpersonal difficulties. Many people with CPTSD may struggle with feelings of worthlessness or guilt. They might experience difficulties in managing intense emotions and face long-term relationship challenges. Because CPTSD is often rooted in early or repeated trauma, it can shape the way a person views themselves and the world, creating a chronic impact on personality and emotional functioning. Recovery can involve more intensive therapeutic approaches that address not only trauma symptoms, but also these deeper aspects of emotional regulation, development of identity, and social connection. To understand the difference between traditional PTSD and complex PTSD, it helps to look at the types of trauma that generally lead to each. PTSD often develops from what we call single incident trauma. This is usually a specific, identifiable event that disrupts someone's sense of safety and well-being. So think of experiences like a really bad car accident, natural disasters, a physical or sexual assault, or witnessing a life-threatening situation. In these cases, PTSD symptoms typically revolve around re-experiencing the trauma through flashbacks or nightmares, avoiding reminders of the event, feeling hypervigilant, and experiencing distressing emotions tied to that single overwhelming moment. Single incident trauma can be devastating, and it certainly will disrupt a person's life. But because there is a clear before the event and after the event to these specific traumas, treatment often focuses on helping the individual process that singular experience, integrate it, and work through the symptoms that it has triggered. Many people with single incident trauma respond well to treatment approaches like cognitive processing therapy, EMDR, and exposure therapy, which target the specific memories and actions tied to that one event. CPTSD, on the other hand, typically develops from what's known as chronic trauma or relational trauma, where someone endures prolonged, repeated exposure to adverse situations. This might include ongoing abuse, captivity, exploitation, or living in a persistently unstable or dangerous environment. While single incident trauma often has a clear beginning and end, chronic trauma is marked by an ongoing sense of threat, often involving situations where the person feels trapped, helpless, or unable to escape. And a lot of times that feeling is accurate because they're a child and they can escape. They're helpless to change the environment and they are trapped. With CPTSD, the impact goes deeper than memories tied to a single traumatic event. Prolonged trauma affects self-concept and emotional regulation. So individuals with CPTSD often experience intense feelings of shame, guilt, or worthlessness. These feelings don't necessarily emerge from a single memory, but rather from the cumulative effect of repeated harm or neglect. The symptoms of CPTSD include difficulties in forming a stable sense of self, managing emotions, and establishing trust in relationships. Unlike PTSD, which may focus on reliving a specific trauma, CPTSD might involve feeling trapped by a pervasive sense of emptiness or emotional pain that has no single source. Understanding the difference between single incident trauma and CPTSD will help explain why recovery can look so different. Both forms of trauma are valid, and both deserve compassionate treatment. But when it comes to CPTSD, recognizing the complexity of chronic trauma is crucial to ensuring individuals receive the nuanced care they need. One of the root causes often linked to complex PTSD or CPTSD is childhood emotional neglect. When we think of trauma, we might immediately imagine significant overt events like physical abuse or witnessing violence. But trauma also stems from what wasn't there, specifically the absence of emotional support, validation, and nurturing that children need in order to develop a healthy sense of self and a feeling of safety. Childhood emotional neglect happens when a child's emotional needs are consistently ignored or minimized. This can happen in households that appear stable on the outside, but where parents or caregivers might be emotionally unavailable. They might be preoccupied or unaware of their child's emotional world. When a child's emotions are frequently dismissed or overlooked, they may internalize the idea that their feelings don't matter, leading to a sense of unworthiness or self-blame. This experience of being unseen and unheard can profoundly impact their self-perception and their ability to trust others, which are core components in the development of CPTSD. In many cases, CPTSD stemming from childhood emotional neglect includes symptoms that go beyond those typically associated with PTSD. For example, people might struggle with self-identity, feeling unsure of who they are, or feeling inherently defective, or that something's just wrong with them. They typically have a hard time regulating their emotions, and they'll experience intense feelings of anger, shame, or sadness that just seem to come out of nowhere, which reinforces the feelings of something being inherently defective. And because they aren't taught how to navigate their emotions safely, many find relationships challenging, especially in areas like trust, intimacy, and healthy boundaries. And oftentimes, people with CPTSD end up coping with the symptoms of CPTSD with addiction. So when we're working with addiction, initially we're working on stabilizing the individual, developing some traction when it comes to sobriety, understanding the addiction, understanding what's required for sobriety. But that typically isn't enough to keep them in long-term recovery. When I talk about addiction, I will say addiction is a maladaptive coping mechanism. So what are we coping with? And usually behind addiction, we find CPTSD. And so getting into recovery requires us to focus on what led to the CPTSD and healing CPTSD. Unlike PTSD, which often involves specific flashbacks to a traumatic event, CPTSD related to emotional neglect tends to create a more pervasive sense of emptiness, chronic self-doubt, and difficulties in connecting with others. And since the trauma of emotional neglect is subtle and often lacks a distinct event, individuals may not even recognize it as trauma until much later in life, or until they're working with a therapist who points out that this lack of something also led to trauma. I find sometimes with clients when I'm working with them and we are getting into the areas of neglect, and when I talk about it, they try to push back and argue that that didn't really impact them. That didn't have long-standing symptoms that formed because of the neglect. And I'll engage them in those conversations. I'm not going to argue with them, but I will, continue to point out how that might have been different and how children develop based on attachment and attunement. And if that's not present, certain things aren't going to develop, or they're not going to develop, let's say, in a functional, adaptive way. Recognizing childhood emotional neglect as a form of trauma that can lead to CPTSD helps validate these experiences for people who have felt unseen, misunderstood, invisible. Therapy can be immensely helpful here when it comes to CPTSD or CPTSD rooted in emotional neglect, particularly approaches that work on building a sense of self and developing healthy coping mechanisms. Modalities like trauma-informed work, somatic experiencing, cognitive behavioral therapy can address the deeper wounds of emotional neglect and start to help people rebuild a sense of worth and agency. In our clinic, we've started to have our clinicians get trained and certified in what's called lifespan integration. It's developed up in the Seattle area of Washington and has some really good research behind it that looks at these very things, developing a sense of self, being able to go back and work through events or time periods that are specifically impacting an individual, and also to go back to periods of time where attachment did not happen or the attachment failed them, and to do some inner child work as a way of trying to heal the effect of being neglected or not receiving the messages necessary for healthy development. Recovery from CPTSD often involves creating a new internal narrative, one that acknowledges and respects the emotions and needs that were overlooked in childhood. This connection between childhood emotional neglect and CPTSD highlights how our early experiences shape us in ways that are profound and sometimes invisible. But with the right support, individuals can move towards healing and building resilience and reclaiming their lives in ways they might have not thought possible. The treatment approach for CPTSD often looks quite different from classic PTSD. While individuals with single incident trauma may be able to process a specific event and gradually reduce symptoms, those with CPTSD usually need more comprehensive long-term support. This is where EMDR really shines when it comes to single incident trauma and can be life-altering for those who are reliving that specific traumatic event. However, the research shows that EMDR is not as effective when working with somebody. Therapy for CPTSD often focuses on rebuilding trust, starting in the therapeutic relationship, understanding attachment patterns, and learning skills for emotional regulation. Treatments like trauma-informed care and dialectical behavior therapy, attachment-based therapies can help individuals with CPTSD work through the complex layers of their trauma. For many, it's about creating safety where there never was any, and developing a sense of self that can stand independently of the trauma that they endured. A situation we sometimes see, and one that can be uniquely challenging, is when someone with complex PTSD or CPTSD experiences a single incident trauma that might lead to a diagnosis of PTSD. For someone who has already endured chronic trauma, an additional traumatic event can amplify the symptoms, can add new layers of complexity, and trigger responses in ways that may not be typical for individuals with PTSD alone. For example, someone with CPTSD might already struggle with self-identity, emotional regulation, and relational challenges due to past prolonged trauma. If they then experience a new acute trauma, like an assault or car accident, those underlying CPTSD symptoms can intensify. This can mean that on top of re-experiencing the new traumatic event, they may also have a resurgence of painful memories and feelings related to their original long-term trauma. It's almost as if the new trauma reopens old wounds or magnifies unresolved issues that the person has worked hard to manage. In cases like these, individuals might experience an intensified form of reactivity, where even small reminders of the new trauma can lead to intense distress and even further feelings of helplessness or betrayal. This is called re-traumatization because it can feel like a reawakening of earlier trauma. Those with CPTSD may find themselves dealing not only with the flashbacks of the recent trauma, but also with a flood of feelings related to their original unresolved trauma. This can lead to emotional overwhelm, especially in areas where they may have developed coping strategies over time, such as relationships or self-worth. What's unique in these cases is that the presence of CPTSD can complicate recovery from a PTSD event. Often someone with PTSD may be able to work through their symptoms by processing a single traumatic memory and learning ways to regulate their responses. But for someone with CPTSD, the new trauma can add another layer to an already complex emotional landscape, requiring a treatment approach that addresses both a specific new trauma and the deeper foundational issues tied to chronic trauma. Treatment in these cases often needs to be both trauma-focused and supportive of the person's complex pre-existing symptoms. Therapies like EMDR, which is commonly used for single-incident trauma, can be effective, but often have to be adapted. The person may need a more gradual and cautious approach, one that is much more gentle on their nervous system, one that helps work on stabilizing their emotions and addressing relational or attachment issues alongside the new trauma. Therapy might start by helping them manage the immediate symptoms of the recent event, and then slowly integrating work on the deeper CPTSD symptoms. The outcomes for individuals who experience a PTSD event on top of CPTSD can vary, but with appropriate comprehensive support, recovery is possible. Many find that working through both the single incident trauma as well as the underlying CPTSD can even deepen their healing process, as they address layers of trauma that may not have been accessible before. In the end, it's about creating a sense of safety and empowerment that extends across all layers of their experience, allowing for healing not only from recent trauma, but also from the complex foundational wounds of chronic trauma. The DSM-5's choice to keep PTSD narrowly defined and to exclude CPTSD doesn't mean that people experiencing complex trauma responses don't deserve recognition or support. On the contrary, this distinction highlights a need for more specialized treatment. For example, trauma-informed therapy can address both PTSD and CPTSD, but those with CPTSD may benefit from longer-term therapeutic approaches that help rebuild self-concept and relational patterns. There is a question that I have gotten increasingly over the last few years, and it can pop up in a couple of different versions, but they all look something like this. Will whatever this singular intervention they name is fix my trauma? Or how many sessions of this modality will it take before I am healed? That question, in whatever version it comes, reveals two critical mistakes in our thinking about trauma and healing. The first critical mistake in our thinking is the idea that to be traumatized is to be broken in some way that requires a fix. It attempts to render a very complex human experience into something much simpler, like a broken bone. To be very clear, traumatic experiences can leave us with crushing symptoms that steal our peace of mind. To be traumatized is also the perfectly right response to certain life experiences, specifically those life experiences that we cannot bear on our own, but had to. And the symptoms that come from this will need healing, such as recalibrating our nervous system. And this brings me to our second critical mistake in our thinking about trauma and healing, built on the first mistake. When we render our traumatic experiences into an example like breaking bones, we naturally assume that there is an arrival point at which we can declare ourselves healed. I've had a child who had multiple broken bones, and it's about 10 weeks and the cast comes off, and then she could resume her everyday life, right? But traumas are not like broken bones. And healing from trauma is not like when you get your cast taken off and you can move on with your life. Healing from trauma is a long and winding, lifelong path. And, I don't mean that to be the bad news about healing from trauma. I think it's quite the opposite. So if I trade out the metaphor of a broken bone, let's say healing from trauma is a lot more like building a house that you live in for the rest of your life. What do you need when you're building a house? It would help if you had a toolbox. But not only that, you have to know how to use those tools. You could buy all the fanciest tools at wherever, but if you don't know how to use them, you're not going to have a very good house. If you know how to use the tools, you don't just know how to build, but you also know how to improve and repair as the years go by. Traumatic experiences cannot be easily integrated into our brain's filing cabinet or filing systems like other experiences. So they tend to stick out of the filing cabinets and they cause symptoms. But instead of remembering, we relive it. Telling and retelling your experience with someone who can help you organize, categorize, and assign meaning to the memory and help you feel through some of the overwhelm can help your brain put the memory away in an integrated way. This in turn can help you stop reliving it. Again, we're not going to forget it, but I find that I will hear clients start talking about it differently when it is integrated. They can talk about the event. They can talk about their childhood. They can use descriptors. They can talk about the impact that it's had on them and the struggles that they experienced because of that. But they also can then talk about the healing process and what is different today. That would be an example of being integrated. One of the examples sometimes I will use with clients. So when one of my kids was in kindergarten, we moved into this new home that we had recently built. I mean, not ourselves. We do not build houses ourselves. But we had moved into this new home and we and the neighbors across the street from us were the first houses on our street to be finished. And I think we moved in the same weekend. And there was a lot of construction. There was a lot of people coming and going in our neighborhood and particularly on our street throughout the day. And this one particular daughter had met a friend who lived at the end of our street and around the corner, like just right around the corner, the first house right there around the corner, that's where her friend lived. And so they wanted to walk to kindergarten together. They had afternoon kindergarten. And so I would stand out on my front porch where there was a sidewalk and I would watch her get to the end of the street. And then she would turn the corner. And typically this friend was sitting out on her front porch waiting. And so once she turned the corner, I couldn't see her anymore and I would go back in the house. And so this one particular day, I stood out there. I watched her walk to the end of the street. She turned the corner and that was her friend's house. And then also like maybe 3 houses more was the elementary school. So it was not a far walk to get to the elementary school. And so I went back in the house and I was in the kitchen when all of a sudden I hear this frantic knocking on the back door of the kitchen. And I can see because it was one of those, I don't know what they're called, but it had glass in the door. And so I could see it was this daughter who I had just watched turn the corner. And I opened the door and she comes in and she is frightened. And I said, "What happened?" And she said, "Someone tried to kidnap me." Now, I don't know if that actually happened, that I became aware in that moment that, oh, there are a lot of people who are in this neighborhood that I have no idea who they are. I don't know if they're safe people. I don't know. I didn't get too alarmed, but I said, "What happened?" And so she would tell me the story. And then she told me about how she ran through the backyards because the van couldn't go on the dirt. And so she got home and ran up the back steps onto the deck and knocked on the door. And I said to her, "Oh, that's so brave of you. Good job handling that. You knew just what to do in that moment to keep yourself safe and to get home to mom." I gave her a hug and I think I drove her, went and picked up the friend and dropped her off at school. And then she would typically walk home with her older sisters who had been at school for the full day. But I found her multiple times, like we might be driving in the car and she would say, "Mom, remember when I almost got kidnapped?" And I would say, "Yeah." And she would tell me the story. She would say, "You watched me and I got to the end of the street and I turned the corner and a van drove by." I'm not remembering the whole story today. That daughter's like 25 now. So, and then she would say, "And then I knew I was not safe or I was in danger. And I ran through the dirt and I ran back to the home and I knocked on the back door and you opened it. And I told you what had happened. And you told me I was safe and you told me I was brave and that I knew just what to do to get back home to you." And I would say, "Yep, I remember that story." And for probably 6 months, not like every day or anything, but initially it was probably several times a week. We might be at home, I might be cooking dinner, and she'd say, "Mom, remember how I almost got kidnapped?" And she would tell me the event of the story. And I would say, "Yes, I remember. And you knew just what to do and you got yourself home. And I'm so glad that you kept yourself safe and that you got home to Mom." And that was just something she was doing. I would say that was probably for her a specific traumatic event. Because again, whether she was almost kidnapped or not, her lived experience was, I almost got kidnapped. And I wanted to empower her by telling her that A, she knew just what to do in order to get back. And she was so smart going along the dirt lots in order to get back home. And that she got home to me and she was safe. And I knew this process of her telling the story and going through the events and then bringing it into the present. And then I got safe and I got back home and you told me I was brave and you told me I knew just what to do, that this was a way for her to integrate that event. And so whenever she would feel the need to tell me the story, she would tell me the story. And I would reinforce that, yes, you knew just what to do. And I'm so happy that you're safe. And I'm so glad you got back home. And then I drove you to school. And yep, that all happened. And so that is a way that we integrate things. We tell the story. We talk about what happened. But we also, I think it's important that we also bring it into the present. And usually with clients with CPTSD, they do have some memories. There's a felt sense of not being safe or not being good enough or not being valued or not being lovable. There might be that felt sense. There might be that felt sense that they have. But there's also some stories that they can tell me that go along with that. And again, like I was saying earlier, it's not just one source for that memory, like it was for my daughter, but there's multiple stories that they can tell that explain that lack of safety or that sense of not being enough or not being lovable or something inherently being wrong with who they are. And so as we talk about that experience, it can be important. And that's part of what I'm doing in Lifespan when we're running a specific Lifespan protocol or when we're doing a Lifespan session. But also sometimes as we're talking in therapy, maybe it came up, something we were saying triggered this memory and they're telling me about it. And then I might say, "And what happened after that? And then what happened? And then this happened." And, I might have enough of their life story. I don't have everything from every year, but I have enough that then I can bring it in. And I'm like, "Oh, and then you started therapy and now we're here." And I do it in a way that it feels very natural to the conversation that we're having in a session. But it is a way of saying this event happened in a specific time and place. We are not living in that time and place any longer. The good news is, if we can become aware of our nervous system and how it works, we can intervene in our dysregulated system and learn how to regulate it. Typically, there's two umbrella categories of nervous system intervention, and there can be many tools within each one. So the first one we talk about is a top-down regulation. One of the things that leads to dysregulation in the body is an overactive alarm system in the brain. When the amygdala sets off an alarm because it is reliving a trauma, it sends your body into an intense stress response. And this is great when you are in danger, but it's inconvenient when you're just trying to get through your workday and it's actually not accurate that you're in danger and it's just a trigger. But the good news, again, is that we can intervene by manually redirecting our brain function and slow down the stress response. One of the things that happens when our sympathetic nervous system comes on board, which is activated when it senses alarm or danger, and it goes into fight, flight, freeze, or fawning or appeasing, our breathing shifts. Our breathing will go higher in the body. It's going to be more shallow because that's preparing us to either fight or run or whatever that part of our brain, that limbic part of our brain determines is the best course of action. And so even if it's not accurately detecting danger, our breathing will still go shallow. It'll go more up into our chest. And when we recognize that actually I'm not in danger, just shifting that breathing down more into the belly breathing, which is what happens when we're just going throughout our day and we are feeling a sense of safety and security as we go throughout our day. So noticing when that breathing starts to shift and then redirecting it back into the abdominal breathing can be very helpful. Another tool that we can use and that you could start to use right now is if you think of the video game Tetris, when the game demands your visual spatial system, which is in your prefrontal cortex, blood flow and electrical activity is forced into that area of your brain and away from the alarm system part. This effectively turns the alarm system off, sending a message to your body that it's okay to calm down. So we might do that by where we notice 5 things in our environment, 4 things that we can hear, 3 things that we can smell, 2 things that we're feeling, and then 1 we're just kind of bringing it back into ourselves and anchoring back into the present moment. Another top-down regulation tool is expressive writing, where we're writing about emotional experiences in a structured way. And that has been shown to have therapeutic benefits by engaging cognitive processing and facilitating. I don't think I mentioned this. Top-down regulation starts in our brain, or it starts in our thoughts or cognitions, and then it's moving down into the body to calm the body. With emotional regulation, one of the reasons this works is because you are actively engaging the rational parts of your brain while processing the emotions. If you're feeling overwhelmed and you take 20 minutes to free write, I usually tell clients, don't edit, don't pause, or even read back what you wrote. Just write. That can be a way that we emotionally regulate. And then the second area under this umbrella is what we call bottom-up regulation tools. Bottom-up regulation is when we're using the body to regulate responses in the brain, which can then intervene in the stress response system. The quickest way to do this is to flip the switch from the sympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for upregulating our system to prepare for danger, to our parasympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for rest and our digestive responses. One of the most reliable ways to activate the rest and digest response is by activating our vagus nerve. This nerve wanders from our brainstem through our abdomen, and it touches nearly all of our major organs on the way down. And there's many ways that we can activate the vagus nerve and trigger a parasympathetic or a calming response in our body. A few of these quick tools that you might be able to start using right now is, like I was talking, practicing diaphragmatic breathing. To practice diaphragmatic breathing, simply inhale deeply through your nose, pushing the breath into the belly rather than on the top of our chest, and allowing the abdomen to expand. And then exhale slowly through pursed lips, constricting the abdomen. Cold water will also activate the vagus nerve through a response known as the mammalian dive reflex. When exposed to cold water, particularly on our face, the body initiates a series of physiological changes to conserve oxygen and energy. The vagus nerve is stimulated, leading to a bradycardic response, or a slowing of our heart rate, as well as other autonomic adjustments that promote a state of calm and relaxation. I know cold plunges have been very trendy in the last several years. I would never do a cold water plunge because I don't like being cold, and I have a hard time staying warm anyway. So I don't know that I would intentionally make myself so cold. But you don't have to do a cold water plunge. You can simply splash your face with cold water. Or if that's not possible, you could hold an ice pack to your chest or run your hands under cold water. Those can all have a similar effect. There's also many therapeutic modalities that are based on bottom-up regulation. I mentioned somatic experiencing therapy, and that prioritizes the bottom-up approach. Trauma-sensitive yoga is also a bottom-up approach, along with brain spotting, lifespan integration, equine-assisted psychotherapy, and dance and movement therapy. So instead of looking for which of these many tools and many interventions will be the cure-all for your trauma, maybe just consider starting to use a toolbox approach. Because healing from trauma is more like building yourself a house to live out the rest of your days in than it is like mending a broken bone. Each tool, whether it's top down or bottom up, will do something a little different. And understanding and utilizing this toolbox can help you heal from trauma, but also prepare you for other stressors that life might have in store for you. Whether you're someone who works in the field of mental health, someone who has experienced trauma, or someone who's supporting a loved one with PTSD or CPTSD, I hope this podcast has given you some clarity. Thanks for tuning in, and don't forget to subscribe for more insights on mental health and trauma, sexual addiction, and betrayal trauma healing. And look for us on our platforms, YouTube. We're on most of the podcast apps available. And also look for our social media accounts and give those a like. At the end of this episode, I want to remind you that your story matters. There's something meaningful in every chapter. Don't wait to share your story until it's finished. Until next time, Jackie.